Hello and welcome to part 2 of our analysis of iCAT04. iCAT4 is part of our All India National Level CAT Test series for CAT 18. In the first part of this analysis, we saw how the verbal section was a reasonably tough section in a moderate to tough mock. In this part, we will analyze the toughest section of the actual CAT, that is DILR. So first, as we said, this was a moderate to tough mock, as you can see here, with an average difficulty of close to 1.94. Now what does this 1.94 indicate? It indicates that if the difficulty level per question is mapped at 1 to 3 on a scale of easy to difficult, then each question would have had an average difficulty level just below 2 or just below moderate. Just to give you a perspective, the actual CAT has been rated somewhere around 1.9 to 1.95. Let's have a look at the DILR section now. In this particular mock, the DILR section was rated at a difficulty level of approximately 2.03 or just about 2, which can be classified as moderate as per CAT standards. Now, a difficulty of 2.03 for maths or verbal would be classified as tough, but here it is classified as moderate because in CAT, the difficulty typically is between 2.2 to 2.25. So in that sense, this was significantly easier compared to the actual CAT. So this mock was classified, or this mock was characterized by a tougher verbal section than usual and an easier DILR section than usual. Let's have a look at the sets now. As we saw in RC, we try and analyze, or we try and identify which sets to attempt based on the subject matter, the number of questions, the word length and the difficulty. Here again in DILR, we look at the topic or the subject matter of the set, which means whether it's a matrix or a Venn or a network and so on. Then the difficulty level, of course, and also its positioning matters. And finally, there is also something called the nature of questions, as in, is the entire set comprising only MCQs or only theta or any questions, or does it have a mixture of the two? Secondly, are there conditional questions, or are all the questions direct, etc. So there are a lot of these intangible factors. However, unlike RC, one thing that remains constant is the fact that there are exactly 4 questions per set. So the number of questions per set is no longer a critical factor in deciding whether that set should have been attempted or not. So the typical breakup of the DILR section is that there are 8 sets with 4 questions each. Generally, the benchmark number for the CAT as far as the sectional cutoff is concerned is 4 sets or 16 questions. If the mock or the section is slightly easier, as in this case, this can go up even to 19 or 20 questions. If it is tougher, it can be satisfied at even 12 to 13 questions. So on the whole, anything between 3 to 5 sets would be a reasonably good performance, with 4 sets being the benchmark number. So the objective of a DILR analysis for CAT would be first to identify the 4 sets that we should have tried in the exam. Now yes, please keep in mind that which set is easy and difficult will also partially depend on your comfort level with that particular subject matter. But broadly, there will be some sets which are by default easier and some which will involve a lot of effort. So when we look at this particular mock, we observe, as we said, that the average difficulty was just more than 2, which was easier than expected. But when I look at the breakup of these sets, I see that there were two sets which were purely difficult, and they were both towards the beginning of the mock of the section, plus they were back to back. And then after some time there was another tough set which was moderate to tough. Coincidentally, if you observe, all three of them were from one area, that is critical path. Of course, the transportation is a more technical application of critical path, and we had put it in the mock just to give you an experience of what to expect if you get a question like this. A transportation question is essentially a very specific case of a critical path where you need to create equations or inequations and then arrive at certain minimum and maximum values. So here, as you can see, all three sets on critical path were on the tougher side. Also, please note that critical path is something which is highly technical in nature or involves a lot of concepts. So that is where it is something where a lot of students find it difficult. So in that sense, eliminating the sets which should not have been attempted was a fairly simple thing to do for this mock. Let's have a look at the other questions. If I look at the overall difficulty of the other questions, I can see that 4 of these 5 sets here were below 2, which means they were below moderate. If I look at these, there was one on 2 rows, arrangement in 2 rows, which was fairly simple, easy to moderate. Then there was a numerical logic set on games, again fairly simple, a 5x3 standard matrix, and a 4 set when on novels. So these were all standard questions which you would have seen in multiple mocks before, and all of them could have been attempted. The only other set that was left in this particular mock was an incomplete table on games. This also could have been tried, especially because it was a purely theta set. So even if you would have gone wrong, there was no loss for you. So broadly, if I look at this particular section allowed me to try 5 sets. Even to be realistic, if somebody were to struggle in the 5th one, 4.5 sets were definitely possible. Let's have a look at the difficulty level of each question, just as we saw in the verbal ability section. So as we saw here, in verbal ability, this is the difficulty level of each question from question 35 to question 66. As we can see, both the critical path sets were on the tougher side. Similarly, one more critical path set on the tougher side. Whereas if I look at these rest of the sets, there is not even a single tough question in the remaining sets. Also, for instance, when I look at the set on arrangements, you answer the first question in reasonable time. That is why it is marked as a moderate question, and then everything becomes very easy. Similarly, when I look at the set on games, I answer the first question in reasonably quick time, and then everything becomes easy. For the other 2 sets, yes, it was the same logic, but there was one moderate question hidden in between. There was this particular set on incomplete table, as we said, but there was no loss because it was a purely numerical entry set. That is why it should have been tried. So when you look at these must attempt sets, here the selection is fairly straightforward. Arrangements, 5x3 matrix, the numerical logic on games, the 4 set well, and the incomplete table if possible. So it was fairly straightforward to attempt anywhere close to 20 questions as well in this particular section. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 sets and see how they could have been attempted. So, in this first one, which I said should have been solved as the 5th option. So here it is essentially like a minesweeper game. where there are 10 bombs in 10 cells, and a bomb is represented by the letter M. So you'll observe that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9, 10, all the bombs are given. Then there are certain rules that are given, which means that if the number represents a number of bombs, etc., QF represents the cell, and so on. So certain rules are given, and you need to try and fill this table and try and see where the other numbers will get filled. And because we know that there are only 10 bombs, all the bombs are shown here, so there can be no other bombs, so a lot of these cells will remain empty. So once you make this table on your scratchpad and fill the rest of the data, answering these questions becomes fairly simple. The only challenge in the exam is that every time there is a conditional question, you would have to make the table again. That is why I would try it at the end, because it would make it slightly time consuming. If I look at this second set, this, as I said, was a classical transportation problem where you generally have a warehouse or a supply which has a certain quantity. Then you have retail outlets where you have a certain demand, and then you have cost of transportation which has to be minimized or maximized. So those are the questions that are asked here. If you know this particular question type called transportation, which anybody who's done operations or done certain streams of engineering would know, then it becomes fairly simple. But even if you don't know that, then yes, it can be solved logically, but it would become time consuming. So it was a tough question in that sense because it required certain technical knowledge to be known. If that knowledge was not known, the question could still have been solved, but taking a lot more time. The third question, which was based on activities dependent on each other, was actually tough because there was this concept of earliest time by which activity X can be completed, maximum time, slack, and then there was also this concept that some activity E dependent on B and D, but after B it took 0 days. So this was a new concept that you would have not seen earlier, and that really made it difficult. So this was a great set to solve at home, but possibly not something worth solving in the exam. If I look at the rest of the sets, this was fairly simple. 20% students do not read something. So the rest of 80% would read at least one novel. The rest of the students read at least one novel from 4 ABCD. This total is given. Who read exactly 2 is given. 15 read all. No student reads exactly 3. So everything else can be really filled in. So it was a fairly simple question. Here you just needed to know how to create the 4-set web. Again, this was a fairly straightforward question. 12 animals, 12 cages, A to L, cages on either side of the path. So A to F are on one side, G to L are on the other side, and then you just fill the arrangement. So this was more like MHCET in CAT, but this was given like a variety. This one was again the critical path, which was on the tougher side. So you had distances between cities, you had to create the network, and then there were conditional questions once again. So that made it not only difficult but time consuming as well. When I look at the last two sets, this one looked difficult because there was this grid that you had to fill using certain rules. So there was a square with 9 equal squares in it, and then each of them are divided into 4 triangles. So you had to fill things as per the rule. But once you drew this again on your scratch pad, now unlike the first set where you had to draw that Minesweeper table and keep drawing it for every question, here if you drew it once and filled it, all the questions could be answered directly. So that was the beauty of this question, and hence it should have been definitely tried. The last one was a standard matrix where you had 5 restaurants. There were 5 dishes, and for each restaurant, there was a certain order in which the dishes were ordered. So you had to just arrive at the order for each particular restaurant, and that would have been your answer. So again, something that was fairly easy to be solved. So on the whole, if I were to look at this section, it was a quite easy section in a moderate to tough mock. In a way, it balanced out the tough verbal section. It was easily possible to try and attempt 5 sets out of 8. The 3 which were not to be attempted were all from one area, that's critical path. 20 questions would be a good performance as far as this mock is concerned, or this section is concerned. In part 3 of our analysis for this mock, we will discuss the quant section. The analysis for all our previous mocks and the verbal section is already available on our official YouTube channel, the link for which is given here. You can subscribe to our channel by clicking this link. To get notifications every time a new video is put up, please hit the bell button. Feel free to put in your comments, feedback or questions on the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.